This is not like anything I've ever covered here. And so it's been very, very strange to see tear gas and explosives from police sort of rising up into these buildings and these streets that, I walked around quite a bit.
Lindsey Wasson has been taking photographs in her hometown of Seattle for 7 years, 3 of those as a Reuters photographer. Sunday, June 7th, 2020 is a day she remembers vividly. And Lindsey joins me now. Great to see you, Lindsey. Thanks for talking with us. Look, before we discuss your photographs, just talk us through, Lindsey, if you could, what happened that day on the streets. It was a day of 3 or 4 very distinct parts. It was a very fast-changing narrative, right?
Correct. So long work day, June 7th into the morning of June 8th. But the day kind of began with me covering this very large community organized protest. And then I moved to the Capitol Hill protest, which was this group of protesters that was outside of the East Precinct, the Seattle Police Department's East Precinct. And at some point, a man drove up and there was a shooting, and the protest continued late into the night. The police began to use their dispersal tactics, tear gas, pepper spray, blast balls, and then there was a lot of sort of organized pushback and even Hong Kong tactics that have been used by protesters to sort of fend off against police.
Well, let's take a look at 4 photographs that you've picked that actually depict these different incidents very, very clearly. The first one we'll put up on the screen now. These silhouettes of people standing on the top of a restaurant. What was going on here, and what prompted you to take this picture, Lindsey?
So this was the very large community protest in Rainier Beach. They called it the We Want to Live March. And, went about 2 miles from a park to a local Safeway parking lot. Halfway along the march, this group of men had sort of, I don't know if they were part of the restaurant or, how they got on the roof. You can kind of see the fists in the air, which have been, a sort of mainstay, sort of symbolic gesture in many of these protests. And so there was something that, it's visually was obviously a very compelling scene. There was a sense of solidarity.
All right. Second picture. Now, this is a picture used by many of our clients. Did you see the gun in this man's hand before you took this photograph?
No. And I think that the whole kind of the main event really took under 2 minutes. The way that I was photographing this was through, it's probably important to point out, I was in the office of this alternative biweekly newspaper called The Stranger. And, I had heard screaming, sort of, whipped my head around, wasn't really sure what was happening, but this car was sort of driving up towards the main group. And so I kind of just started photographing because I knew something was happening, but at the time I wasn't really sure, obviously what was going to happen. I wasn't sure what the intention of the driver was. But, obviously something very, newsworthy and scary was happening.
And it's interesting. So you were up in this building. So the vantage point is from above. And do you ever, as a photographer, wish you'd been on the ground in the middle of that? I mean, clearly there are security issues, but from a photographic perspective, from an artistic perspective,
I think, obviously, yeah, it's hard to want to be on the ground in front of a car that's driving towards you, but clearly I would have had to have basically been on the side, the driver's side of the car, which is obviously the side in which a gun was pointing out. It's really hard to tell if that would have made a better photograph just from a photographic standpoint.
Yeah. All right. Let's move on to the third and the fourth photographs. The third one, this is, it seems to me, and tell me if I'm wrong here, but there's a sense that things are kicking off now on the streets of Seattle. What's going on here?
So this was around midnight, roughly. After the shooting happened, they continued to protest. No one left. And so this continued for, several hours until about midnight when the police used their dispersal tactics. But you can kind of see these lines of officers, coming through. And this was after they had deployed the sort of first couple of rounds of, tear gas and all of their different tools. And these two protesters were just standing there. I think one has kind of like a bouquet of flowers that you can see.
Yep. What do you like? What do you like about this picture?
What I liked about this angle is, this overview is that it gives you a little more context. You can see more of the scene. And, it also kind of spoke to some of the chants that they had. A lot of the chants were every day and, we're not tired. And the protesters made it very clear that they were not going to go away anytime soon.
And then onto the fourth picture. Again, this is clearly around the same time. You mentioned Hong Kong at the beginning of this discussion. I mean, it's quite an abstract photo, this one. Did Hong Kong protests and the umbrella as a symbol of those protests come into mind before you took this picture?
Oh, absolutely. I've been seeing the evolution of the strategy and the tactics, and many of them have been Hong Kong related. So you can kind of see this person, I don't even know the gender, I don't know the race of this person, but because they're so covered, but you can see the umbrella that, they're sort of using as a defense. You can see this tipped over orange cone, which, people have used to kind of put over tear gas or to put over other explosives.
Is it surreal being on the streets on which you grew up taking photographs like these?
This is not like anything I've ever covered here. Absolutely. I actually went to college about 4 or 5 blocks away from this Capitol Hill protest. And so it's been very, very strange to see, tear gas and explosives from police sort of rising up into these buildings and these streets that, I walked around quite a bit.
Sure. Final question, Lindsey, and I feel it's one we have to address. It's hard to avoid discussions at the moment that a majority of news photographers taking pictures at a lot of these Black Lives Matter protests are white. Is that something you and your peers talk about? Is that something you think about when you're doing what you do?
A lot of things feel different about this protest movement, and one of them is the amount of conversation that is happening in the photojournalism industry. And I think that when I'm out covering these, I'm very cognizant of the fact that, I'm a non-Black photographer covering a Black movement. And I think that we as journalists have power in telling these stories, but creating this narrative. And so I think that it would behoove all of us who are not Black, if this is your assignment, to think very deeply about power and about how your presence is affecting the people that you're covering and the communities that you're covering.
Yeah,
and I think we should do that all the time.
Yeah. All right, Lindsey. Look, I'm going to stop it there. It's been a real pleasure talking with you, and a real pleasure preparing for this and looking through these photographs that you've been taking. So stay safe in Seattle. Lindsey Wasson, thanks very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you so much.